properly.
Oh, I gotta get in Twitch chat for all of our adoring fans.
And tell me when you're in Twitch chat, and I bring us up from behind the. Yeah, so something I did want to do, but I held back was when you were when you posted something about like oh, you posted a guide about making a Discord community server. I was gonna
Mhm.
post from the some derps thing. It's like, this might be useful or something like that.
I'm actually reposting that blog. That blog is a collection of blogs that I've written over the last couple of months, and I'm doing a big uh putting them all together, and we're putting it up on like Medium and Gava Sutra and stuff.
Ooh, very cool, very cool. All right, I'm gonna bring this out from behind the curtain.
Okay.
All right, so we're live. Hello, welcome to Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host Mango,
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
and
I'm so excited to be here.
today we're gonna talk a little bit about WoW patch 9.1, what it contains, what it kind of doesn't contain, and stuff around that. Before we do that, Buddy, why don't you the fuck's at home? What it is we do on this podcast?
Well, on this podcast, we talk about games. A lot about one in particular game, I guess, recently, because we're just playing a lot of WoW. But I guess it's not a Valheim episode, so there's that. So for viewers who tuned into BlizzCon, which was a couple weeks ago now, three or 4 weeks ago now, um, patch 9.1 was announced at BlizzCon. It's called Chains of Domination. It features a bunch of new content that we expected to see. We have a new raid, a new mega dungeon, which are like the big 8 boss dungeons. They've done 2 of these so far, Mechagon and Return to Karazhan. Did they do one in Draenor? No. It includes a new zone off of the Maw, which is called like something. Can't remember what it's called. I want to say Vorheim, but I know it's not like a Heim. It's just like Vor something, which is this like long abandoned, piece of the Shadowlands that the jailer like used his anima to like send the chains out. This is actually a neat lore thing. The Maw is technically created out of like the desiccated husks of like alternate Shadowlands like zones and destinations, if that makes sense, for like like souls to go to. And so it's kind of this like cobbled together, garbage island in a way in reality, which I thought was like that's kind of neat. Um,
I got a question about that actually. So
sure.
is it like a like because we do know that there are more afterlives that we just don't have insight into, right?
Hmm.
Which is why we can't just go visit all of our best friends. Some of them might be off in like I don't know.
Correct.
Is there like a good shining example of an afterlife that we know exists that isn't accessible from Shadowlands?
So the most we have is anytime we've gotten a glimpse into an afterlife that like this is a retcon tool for like
Okay,
WoW continuity, right? Because there've been a couple of times in like the books, for instance, where like people like peek beyond the veil or
right.
whatever, and they go to they go to some other thing. Like so, for instance, at the end of Battle for Azeroth, we get a sort of epilogue with Sourfang, where Sourfang is now on this, like on his boar farm in his that's his afterlife, right? Like he didn't end up in any of the like the typical Shadowland zones. But the best example of that, by the way, is Helheim, which is, if you remember,
Oh, right.
in Legion we could take that portal and it took us to the it's the Helheim, right? the
Yeah.
the place where Helia is. um that's in the Shadowlands, and that is like Helia's domain for the Kavaldir. um she's obviously, we know she's aligned with the jailer because of, she's there in the Maw, in the escape from the Maw scenario, and she also shows up in,
She gets referenced a couple times.
yeah, in the Kyrian campaign. She shows
Hmm.
up in the Kyrian campaign, but yeah. So um but anyway, so we're getting new zone, new dungeon, new raid, um, a bunch of new content along those lines, right? We know that the Covenant campaigns are shifting. The Maw is going to change. Like patch 9.0 version of the Maw is going to be markedly different in 9.1, which that might be the thing I'm most excited for, because we've actually never really seen one of these before. Typically, you get a new zone and then you move on from it, but that zone kind of stays like time locked. But I really like the idea that like the Maw will change over the course of the expansion as we are doing more, presumably more Shadowlands business. Uh, But one thing that we did not get was systems, right? Most of the time when they do a big patch announcement like this, they will also sit down and say, hey, this is the new system that we're introducing, right? In 8.2, it was the Heart of Azeroth. In 8.3, it was corruption, right? In 7.2, it was the expansion. There's like a little ring expansion that went on to all of the artifacts. It was that expansion. In 7.3, it was the Netherlight Crucible, which like, had that little tree
Mm.
on the Vindicar that you could like put your relic slot in or whatever else. Normally they explain that stuff in like the patch announcement, but in this one they said, you know what? We're not talking about any of that stuff today. We're gonna just put it up on the PTR and we're gonna see what you think, and we're gonna listen to all of the feedback about the systems that you think have worked so far in 9.0, that you'd like to see expanded in 9.0, that you think are good or bad or whatever else. So I guess this is our version of giving that feedback, right?
Yeah. And so 9.5 launches tomorrow, right? 9.0.5.
Yeah,
rather.
9.0.5 comes out tomorrow, which is WoW has major patches and minor patches. Minor patches are the midpoint, which is like, so for instance, in 8.2.5 was like an allied race. They just added an allied race to the game, and they did like an auction house overhaul or something like that, right? Like this is where, and they added like the portal room, for instance, right? Like they just do like minor shit to like keep things together. 9.0.5 includes the Valor changes, which by the way have fully aligned with what we asked for, because they have just recently announced that the overall cap is 5,000, and that increases by 750 weekly, right? So like over the course of you can earn up to that match, and there's no weekly cap anymore. So you can just have it, you can just earn as many as you want, which is exactly what I wanted, because counterintuitively, when there's a cap, I hate it, but when
Because
it's
you
uncapped,
wanna,
it feels good.
yeah. Because when it's capped, you wanna make sure you fill the cap. Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, somebody in Blizzard is obviously listening to us. Feel free to call us. We got more ideas.
we got more ideas for sure. Yeah. It also includes a lot of covenant tuning. For instance, my covenant is changing. One of the things that I said at the beginning of the expansion is that I'm choosing a covenant based on aesthetics and based on sort of like lore preference, because I know that they're never going to redesign the lore armor, right? Like that plate armor is going to be that plate armor forever, right? But they will rebalance and retune and change the covenant ability. So my ability, Conqueror's Warbanner, is getting redesigned. It is no longer placed on the ground. I now carry it on my back. It has a shorter duration, a shorter cooldown, and gives mastery instead of raw critical strike. So so that kind of thing is happening. A bunch of the legendaries are getting changed and buffed around. For instance, the arms legendaries are getting pretty hefty buffs for single target content. I guess arms is doing okay in AoE. That makes sense. Like there's a lot of like underperforming legendaries that they're just trying to like bump up to make competitive. Though my understanding is that does not include the reduced cooldown of Touch of Death legendary. So big rip, I guess, on that.
Yeah, no, I have not looked at these, so I'm just kind of looking over them quickly. Night Fae, the changes are apparently the pod tender pod isn't broken anymore, which is
Yes.
great. Probably makes that much more viable.
Also, there are a bunch of bug fixes on Phaline Stomp, so you should be happy about that. Apparently, Phaline Stomp was just not doing damage in certain scenarios.
Really?
Yeah. If you use Phaline Stomp to start combat, it wouldn't do damage, according to the patch notes.
Oh well, good to know. Yeah, no, I guess that explains some things. That definitely explains some things. Nothing super important, right? Because like when we're raiding, right, which is I guess the most important application of that. Like, yeah. I'm not starting combat, or wait, no, that can't be true, because I pulled the first boss in the raid with Phaline Stomp, if you remember.
Oh yeah, you're right.
It must be a little bit conditional on that. Like there must be something. It must be inconsistent or whatever. Like
because I know that there's a couple of bugs with Windwalker that they're changing. Some of them which are hurting DPS, by the way. Windwalker has a bug right now that is making their Mark of the Crane sit at max stacks, when it's not supposed to, right? Like it's supposed to be falling off of dead bodies in a way that it's not. And so, which is part of why windwalkers are really gross in certain kinds of content because they just sit at max stacks of spinning crane kick or whatever that thing is called.
No, that's spinning crane kick. I was looking, I was like, I hit something and it's like instantly like at 6 stacks. I'm like,
Yeah,
what?
that
Yeah,
is specifically the bug that they call out in the patch
yeah.
notes. They're like,
So I'm like,
that's not supposed to happen.
yeah, I'm staring at it. I'm like, this can't be stacks, right? Like it must be like I'm like looking at, oh, they made it only affect maximum 6 targets, so it must be like the number of targets arranged or something like that, right? It's like no, apparently not. But maybe that means they can get rid of that spinning crane kick talent. I'll figure that out.
You might be able to. I mean, I definitely have seen that kind of thing happen in the past, where like certain builds are only good because of the because of the bugs that
Yeah,
enable them,
yeah.
essentially.
No, and so there's a talent that when you proc and you get a free spinning crane kick, which I replaced something else that was a little bit more passive. I figured, oh, whatever, right? Like, but this is also one of those things where like, you get down into the weeds of like the Windwalker rotation. You're only supposed to be using spinning crane kick regularly if you've got like 3 or more enemies to hit, I believe is the number.
Mhm.
But this explains why when I'm like staring at freaking logs, it's like the top parsers all have like 15 to 30% of their damage coming from spinning crane kick. I'm like, what's happening, right? Like, why like am I not like am I supposed to be procking more? Like, what's the So yes, so this is actually a funny thing because for me, what this will mean is that my parses will go up in the rankings, but my damage will stay the same. 'Cause-
That's true. They might reset the parses, actually. They'll do this sometimes on balance patches where Warcraft logs will make a hard break and say like new parses starting today.
ah,
They haven't, as far as I know, they haven't done that all expansion, which means that like you are competing against like not just all of your own parses, but like every Windwalker that has been raiding for the last 4 months, um, which affects the rankings like quite a bit. I actually got a couple 100% parses yesterday because I was running low level mythics with a friend to carry him, and and so like in mythics it will track your parse by the percentage of the key. So it's like, what do arms warriors or what do demonology warlocks at this key level tend to perform like? And the answer is when I'm in there, they tend to perform at 100% because nobody who's as well geared as me goes into those.
yeah, right. That was the thing I was considering, right? Because one of the guys we raids with, shout out to Merak, right? Is the one that like parses super high on like his rogue.
Yep,
Yeah,
Marok.
and I think part of that is like he's the only one that like plays that spec, right? Or,
Yeah, Assassination was the worst spec in the game, and he's been playing it since the beginning. This is also why I'm the #2 Necrolord's Arms Warrior worldwide, because there are just no other Necrolord's Arms Warriors. I think there's a total of 10,000 over in North America. Um, but I just don't think a lot of those. I bet a lot of those are like alts or not pushing high level content in the same sort of way. Um,
yeah, I'm gonna have to look at these changes at some point just to see because I see that like Zuin's battle gear and House might got upgrades, but not much else. I desperately want that touch of death to be like more relevant than it is. Although I don't know
I
how
kind
you
of
do
wish,
it.
yeah. It's hard to balance that touch of death legend because like what else can you do? Because like you can't really make touch of death like do more damage in a way, or like maybe I don't know. Well, maybe this is a good place to talk about 9.1 systems changes, right? Like, what would you like to see if you were to buff that legendary or to change that legendary?
Yeah, see, I don't know, like maybe you can um open like maybe you can do it at the beginning of combat too, right? Like just because like just
Hmm.
so it has a little bit more um uh is a little bit more relevance in raid fights. So fail chimes in, casting something lowers the cooldown of touch of death by X amount of seconds. So that's like a neat idea, but like it's it's already down to a minute, right? And that's like super quick. And that would make it better for like mythics.
But
Um,
it's not like a minute. But it's not like so. Like I have Colossus Smash, right? It's 45-second cooldown.
yeah,
I use that multiple times during a fight. I'll use that 5 or 6 times over the course of a 3 or 4 minute fight. Um, that is different than Touch of Death because Touch of Death you functionally can only use it once
yeah,
in a raid fight,
yeah.
and it only hits for like a quarter or a third of the damage. Like, what if Touch of Death became a more conventional cooldown that you could just like do all throughout an enemies, is 30k damage every minute too much damage? Probably.
Well, it's not 30k. Well, like let's say that like it works like it does right now, and you could still get that, like, skill out that last one to get the extra damage on it. But it's like, I think it's like 15% of your max health if you're. Oh no, it's not 15%. It's 30% of your max health if you're just doing it and they're not below your health level.
Okay, 30% of your max health, that's 10k.
Okay, yeah, so 10k a minute every minute. Interesting. Like, and I think you leave the skill aspect on that, right? Like, I think that'd be fun.
Mhm.
I haven't crunched the numbers to know if that's broken or not, but it would definitely, like you said, it would definitely be super fun.
Yeah, I definitely get that. So in terms of when I think of systems for the game, right? We have renown, which is sort of the macro system, which like over time, as you are increasing your renown, you are powering yourself up, getting more stamina, getting more soul binds, getting more conduits, all this other sort of stuff. Then there's legendaries, right, which are outside of the renown system technically. And it's just about how much, like it's just about farming like soul ash from Torghast. What in those couple, and then renown has conduits and soul binds, right? What in those systems do you want to see like expand? Like what would when a WoW content patch promises more? What is the more in those systems that you want to see?
So, more. I think I want more to do with the soul ash. I don't know what
Oh,
that looks
interesting.
like necessarily. Um, I want more to do with, I think, one of the other resources. That that there's like, it's like not a lot to. Oh, with the souls. I assume that was something that was coming at some point, right? Because like there's like a hard cap on what you do with them. Um, and also like
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure they're going to expand the Covenant Sanctums in 9.1
yeah.
as to like stretch into the Maw, because they said that like the thing in 9.1 is that all the Covenants are going to the Maw and fucking shit up.
Yeah, that makes
So I
sense.
imagine that will include new Sanctum upgrades that will be using souls, that will be using anima.
Yeah, and so that's the other side of things. And this is like a weird request, but like I feel bad because like I feel like I need to like save my anima to spend on Sanctum upgrades, and I don't get to buy any of the cool stuff, right? Like any of like the cool stuff that are like rewards until I finish those out, right? And I'm not playing super consistently anymore. Like I show up for raid and whatnot, but like I'm like making like maybe like 3 to 4k on like a good week now, and I know I could push that, but like it's still like well, I've got to get my third, fourth, and fifth upgrades for I think you get my last upgrade for the battle table and like my third, fourth, and fifth upgrades for the Queen's Garden, which is like
Yeah, okay, you and me are like in more or less. I think I have the third upgrade for the Abomination Factory, which is the Necrolord version of that. But otherwise, we are like at that same point, which I think technically means that there's only like 25,000 anima left before my Covenant is fully upgraded. But that also feels like a huge amount,
yeah.
obviously.
Oh yeah. And maybe like that's the thing I would expect though is like acceleration on like anima gain.
Mm,
Just because like I think that kind of naturally happens over the course of an expansion.
yeah.
That way, like people who come in at the last minute can like get things done before the new expansion comes, which is fine. But like, I also just like it's like I should do this, and it's like, well, I could get any of the cool, cosmetics, but then that's 5k, and that's 5k that I don't have to spend on the sanctum upgrade. So I don't know, maybe just I bet you an acceleration there would like make like I bet you by the end of the expansion, whether I stick around for it or if I come back at the end, right? Like I will feel about as good about anima as I do, or I will feel fine about anima again, I guess. Way to put it. Um,
Do you feel like the so I feel like the tension there is always between people who are invested from the beginning, right? Like there's a player like me. I have a 6 month sub. I'm probably going to be playing this game all the way through, right? Like unless something catastrophic happens. Um, right? Like envision that I'll be playing the entire game from start to finish, right? And I need things to spend my anima on. I need to gain anima, and I need to have stuff to buy with that anima, right? But then also players who come in and need catch-up mechanics in order to like get to that point. I think that that's very important for Renown because Renown has systems functionality, right?
Yeah,
Like
and
my
it's hard
DPS.
time gated too.
Yeah. So like for instance, in 9.1, I think Renown will probably have a catch-up mechanic that bumps you to 40 pretty much instantly. You know, like maybe it's something like if you complete the 9.0 version of the Covenant campaign, you immediately go up to 40, right? And then you start ticking Renown weekly like everybody else in 9.1 will start ticking Renown.
So
I think
maybe
they're going to add another 40 levels of Renown. It seems like that. I think I read that somewhere. So it seems like there's going to be more renown to get over the course of like 9.1, but I feel like that's a really tough sell to me if a fresh character has no good way to catch up to like a main character.
so. Part of me wants to say that I don't like so. I think I started late, and I think it let me catch up to like the current week's level of renown. Which I think that system is mostly good, except for when you get to kind of grindy, like free some souls this week, and then go like go get 1,000 anima. Like that's gonna like more naturally gate you. So I think you're right. I think you essentially let people play through the Covenant campaign as fast as they want to, and then yeah, maybe just jump them. Maybe jump them. I don't know if you jump them to 40 on 9.1. Maybe you jump them like to the end of the Covenant campaign point,
Mm-hmm.
and then like
Okay, that's
make
like
the
25 or something, 30 maybe.
yeah, and make them do every others for like or make them do the 2 a week for like 5 to 6 weeks or whatever it is.
Yeah, I feel like the catch-up mechanics they have right now are actually pretty good, but it's pretty good at small numbers, right? Like if I need to catch up to someone who is at week 55, right? If Baron is at 55 renown and a new character is at 0, I don't think that the current catch-up mechanics are going to be good enough to carry that character up, right? Like generally speaking, if I have a fresh character, I want that character to be like geared and playable in about 2
Mm.
weeks, maybe 3 weeks or whatever. And so, asking me to spend more time than that in order to get them prepared to do
Oh right,
content is
because
like
you
that's
need
like
the
a pretty
Covenant
big ask.
unlocks. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, so what are the big things there? There's the Covenant tree unlocks, and there's the I guess you might count the stamina gains, like 2% stamina, maybe for tanks is important. Um, I think the other things though aren't super duper important, right? Like
Yeah, I mean the cosmetics and stuff that doesn't matter.
yeah, and the
I
battle
feel like
table, right?
once the soulbind trees are fully unlocked, I think that it's
Yeah,
fine.
I think maybe that's probably the way to do it. Is you jump forward the soulbind trees. You find a way to jump forward the soulbind trees so that people can jump into it. Right? It was fine when everybody was gated because everybody could only be at a certain point. It wasn't anything. I don't think it was ever too much to ask somebody to catch up to the end of the soulbind trees.
Mm-hmm.
Like the worst version of this was like not having your row unlocked for raid on like Tuesday, but I don't even think that was too bad. Um,
Yeah, I mean these are pretty small percentages at that
yeah,
point, right? Like the difference is going to be 1% either way, so it's not a huge deal. Like the big deal is, you know, someone with a fully unlocked soulbind tree and somebody with one
yeah. So
unlock on a soulbind tree, right?
how important do you think it is for people to have the binds unlocked, like and like at level, right? Like not the binds themselves, but the slotted things. I forget what they're called. The conduits, maybe.
Oh, the conduits. Pretty important. I mean, my conduits definitely contribute a good amount of DPS.
Mm.
Uh, I
It-
would say maybe like 2 or 3% of my DPS probably come from conduits. I've been obsessive about the conduits just because I want to be, and you know,
right. So
uh,
how important is it to have like a level like 160 conduit versus a 226 conduit, and like how like like how far along that gradient do you have to be before you're like reasonably competitive? Because I can't
man, that's
actually tell.
really interesting. So like I'm trying to just put it in math terms of like my own conduits. What's funny is I actually have logs. I can like take a look at logs and we can kind of see some of this stuff. So for instance, on Bairn in a typical, let's like look at a typical raid. Where is this one we cleared most of the raid? Okay, typical raid, one boss raid, Hungering Devourer, right? Like let's take a look. So I was there on Bairn, 77% DPS. I got 36 cat. Okay, so I have one conduit at item level whatever the base is, like 158, right? Says Mortal Strike has a 10% chance to cast again, right? Like every time you cast Mortal Strike, it might proc an additional time, right? Most of my damage, about 20% of my damage, comes from Mortal Strike. Over the course of 36 total casts. Um, and the difference between the base level is 10%, and that scales all the way up to 16%, which is 6%. Or sorry, 1 out of 6. So 1 out of every 10 casts at first, then 1 out of every 6 casts. Which is actually a pretty marked different. Like, that's a
Yeah.
pretty big difference if you look at 36 casts. That is 3 extra Mortal Strikes for a total. The average hit is 6.7k, right? So that's an average. It's an extra 18k damage, like total damage done. But with 6 casts, that doubles, right? And it's an extra 30 damage. So that's actually pretty. That's bigger than I would have expected, I guess.
Yeah. No. So that's important enough, but like maybe not. Yeah, I feel like you have to boost people up to like some base level of things, or like make them easier to get, right? Like maybe like or like to get to some base level. Like I don't actually remember super well, like because like those base levels just kind of like happened, and I got them, and then it's only been these like last kind of like 187, I want to say, up, like 187 to 220 to 213, or not 187 to 200 to 213 have been the ones where I've been like farming them off of out of the maw, using the mechanics there, because they don't have a super good reliable way to get them in the wild, as it because the world quests.
Yeah, you basically can't get them in the wild anymore at that point.
Yeah. And maybe part of this is everybody gets like a full set of the base ones, that way you don't have to go like hunt them down initially, and maybe a better way to target those conduits that like up to a certain level, right? Like, increase like, something you can buy from Venari, maybe that's like increase a conduit
to like a base level, say
yeah.
increase it up to 200. You would still need to bring it up a certain ways there. That's pretty typical. Normally in patches they bump item levels by a set amount. In BFA it was always 30, right? So it was, the next raid would add 30 item levels, and then but that brought up the bottom too, right? So normal dungeons got bumped by 30. Normal raid got bumped by 30, right? Like everything all came up together, if that makes sense. So that would put, and let's assume now they're doing it by 13, so it's 26 technically. That was like 2 raid tiers in Battle for Azeroth. So if everything gets bumped by 20%, by 26, the current level of normal dungeons is 158. So that brings it up to 184, like pretty naturally. That's what a mythic level dungeon is right now. So the mythic level dungeon will now become a normal level dungeon in terms of item level. And you'll just sort of walk up. That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
It would mean that the bottom level should be 184, I guess, instead of 200. But
yeah. No, that makes sense to me. So I talked about the things that I wanted, but do you have any big ideas for what you want?
So I think I just want new options more than anything else. I'm not necessarily looking for like a deepening of some of the options that we already kind of have, but I would like to see, like, I feel like they should add a new legendary power for like all of the classes, or like all the specs or whatever. I feel like they should add more conduits. Like I would like to have another arms conduit, another, or like another endurance conduit, another finesse conduit, like that kind of thing. Because I actually do think that there's a lot of fun. I was surprised how much this expansion, I'm swapping between conduits and sort of like builds and sort of like soul binds and all this stuff based on kind of any given like week. And I might be alone in that, specifically because like I think there's a certain kind of player that's just a guides player, and the guides never get into these kinds of weeds, right? So, for instance, one week we were at Raid, and I was running Plaguebinder Marileth, but all of the other Necrolords were running a many. But it was actually wrong, as far as I could do the math, to run a many, just because a many's, because we got a second Soulbind conduit, and it was in that specific week, right? So in that specific 2-week period where Marileth was ahead of a many, I swapped to Marileth, but most of the raid who were also Necrolords didn't. So I guess that kind of implies that most people don't really think on this sort of level, but fuck it, I do, and I would love to see like new stuff along these sorts of lines. Because something that is really that I've really kind of connected with is like the depth and breadth of my class in terms of like specific kind of content and how I want to approach it, right? For most of the expansion, I was running a very specific kind of build, but I was sometimes going an execute build. I was sometimes going a a more like smooth single target build. I was sometimes going kind of like this thing. I think most people have like an AoE and a single target understanding, but this is like even more so than that. It's like, okay, well, let's do single target, but a single target that's focused on execute, right? Let's do single target that's focused on smooth damage over the course of the over the course of the experience. Because if I want to, I can create, and this is actually the highest DPS version of my class right now. I could create the execute version of the build, which includes soulbinds choices and conduit choices. And it meaningfully affected my gameplay because I was taking I was taking different talents. I was approaching the fights differently. And I was using some stuff that I just like. I don't know that I just don't know that anybody else cared about this. Like it was pretty Necrolord specific based on how like the banner worked and stuff. Um, but it was like very finicky, I guess, to set up this version of the character, right? Like this build and getting this build off, and I eventually like kind of like moved off it. But now I'm in Mythics, and I'm kind of alternating between a Ravager build, which is pretty bursty, right? In that version, I am doing high amounts of burst AoE DPS every 45 seconds, which is when Warbreaker Ravager is up. And then between those, I'm pretty low DPS, which would be like, kind of the difference between doing 6K for this 15-second window and doing, you know, 2K for the intervening 30 seconds between those videos. But if I go the Dreadnought build, which uses Bladestorm, um, that also has a very high like burst window, but it has smoother damage like overall. And actually the burst windows themselves are fewer and farther between because Bladestorm has twice the cooldown of Ravager. So when Bladestorm is up, it's doing insane amounts of damage. But my in between trash pull damage, right? Like that stuff is different. And so I like the idea of using conduits and using legendaries and using soulbinds to create interesting like ways to build the character and to like play the character and still be doing high level DPS. The funny thing is that, to be honest, my DPS is about the same no matter what I'm doing. It's just like small things like, am I hitting the packs I want to hit with Bladestorm because I'm pieced throughout the dungeon. Or one of the weird things about Bladestorm is I can't interrupt. So it kind of sucks to be using Bladestorm in an interrupt heavy dungeon like Spires of Ascension, where my interrupt might be necessary for any individual pull. And so if I'm just sitting there Bladestorming for 6 seconds, that's actually kind of dangerous, right? And so I guess I would like to see some like different sort of like variety along those lines, especially with the conduits themselves, because I feel like for my class, there's a couple of different conduits. There's an execute conduit that increases execute critical strike damage. There's that mortal strike conduit that doubles up your mortal strike. There's an AoE conduit that says when Ravager or Bladestorm finish, your whirlwind does more damage. There's the Covenant choice itself, right? So mine is just the Necrolord's War Banner is a flat strength amp or whatever. And I feel like I would like to see some conduits that are like finding different aspects of the class to pump up or kind of like emphasize. So for instance, a conduit version of something like in BFA, there was a talent, or not a talent, an Azerite power called Test of Might that said, when I use Colossus Smash, I gain and I spend rage during Colossus Smash, I'm gaining a big strength with like I'm gaining like a big amp of strength at when the test of might ends, right? It gives me a certain amount of strength for every rage I spend during Colossus Smash. I actually kind of like those sorts of, like that sort of a mechanic as a way to differentiate itself from the more general like Mortal Combo just smooths out my damage overall because I'm always casting Mortal Strike throughout over the course of a fight. And so something that is about like big burst windows versus that is like that's an interesting sort of choice for me.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And what you're describing is kind of like we've talked about this before, but like getting WoW to the point where it's balanced enough that you can make these choices based on preference,
Yep.
and like rather than like having to be like a slave to the meta. I think you're right about the guides player thing. I wonder how much value this has to the player base. Like people, like what's the differential between people who don't care enough and just pick the ones that look cool, but care enough to like make these choices, right? Like that feels like it's a small set of people, because I feel like most of the people who care enough to make these choices, like at like an optimization level, are going to be most of them are going to be people who like go to the guides, right, or like go to a sim and just see like what's big number, please, right? Like you either have to be like you, who cares enough to like go like to go beyond and like figure out like micro optimizations, or like you in a different way where you're making choices that aren't necessarily optimal for like fun reasons, right? Like
Yeah, I actually think that there's a sort of sliver that gets missed in these kinds of discussions of player who likes the guides because they get to offload the math, right? But enjoys, so like they don't quite get enjoyment out of creating the build in the same way that I do, right? Like it's just generally fun, walking into like a new raid or whatever with a different build and trying to make that thing like work for me. But I think for a lot of players, it is more about like it's more about like choreography, right? It is someone tell me the dance moves and I am going to master them, right? I am going to, yeah, if you give me all the best stuff to learn, there's still actually a lot there's like a lot of like
it's
intricate detail
execution
in.
mastery.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, I mean, and this is something that I'm still not amazing at. I have problems on a rotational level that probably tank my DPS in bad ways, right? Like, letting a dot fall off or something, like that's
Right.
bad. You shouldn't let your dots fall off. You should be re-upping your dots in the window to whatever they call that, the pandemic window, where you can re-up your dots. You should be casting abilities on cooldown that are like something that I do all the time in arms that fail. I will understand and will also yell at me for, as soon as I explain this, is I will sometimes take overpowers over mortal strikes because I don't want the mortal strike to proc an overpower. So just to explain the way that this works, for an arms warrior, mortal strike costs 30 rage, right? So generally speaking, all the guides will say keep 30 rage in your bank so that every 6 seconds you can hit with a new fresh mortal strike. It is the strongest damage. It's the strongest damage per rage you're going to do until an execute phase, right? Just keep it. But we also have an ability that says for each rage you spend, you have a chance to reset the cooldown on overpower, right? So if you are in a situation where you have a global cooldown coming up and you have both Mortal Strike and Overpower to press, right? The technically correct thing to do in a holistic sense is to press Mortal Strike, because over time that will be correct. But if you press Mortal Strike and proc an Overpower, it would have been correct to go Overpower, Mortal Strike, Overpower, just based on the way
Right.
that works. So it's kind of gambling, and sometimes you lose that gamble. You hit the overpower, and then you use the mortal strike a GCD late, and then you don't get the refresh, and you just sit there for another 2 GCDs, like gaining rage, and you're just like, well, you can't win them all. But like sometimes it does work, and that stuff like feels, it feels like it pays off. It feels like, oh ho ho ho, I'm like outsmarting I'm outsmarting the rotation, but very rarely are you actually outsmarting the rotation.
I know how you feel. I know what you feel about this kind of thing too, right? Like, I mean, I've got like I think I've talked about this on the cast before, but like the moment I came back to the game, I like my muscle memory instantly came back. I started like dialing in the attacks in the way that I always was. And there's some stuff that's like wrong about that, right? Like stuff got patched in different
Mhm.
ways. Um, and like the big one for me is according to the icy veins and the what's there's Peak of Serenity, which is like the monk specific site. Um,
Mhm.
the way you're supposed to do it is you are only supposed to like the chi gainers and the energy spenders only have high priority if you're about to cap energy. And so my worst things are like fisting a fury and like having way too much energy at the end of it, right? Like having like wasted energy ticks at the at
Oh,
cap,
because yeah, Fist of Fury lasts for
or like
2 GCDs,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So if you cap out on energy, you are then wasting the energy that could have then gone into more Tiger Palms or whatever.
yeah, yeah. And another part of that is also like instinctively pressing Tiger Palm. I'm supposed to be pressing the big one now is like Invigorate or whatever it's called, because that's like a thing that no one ever that never in the past was used. It's like a half GCD spell that like heals you for a little bit, but like it gives you 1 chi and it's cheap. Anyway, the
Oh,
other
interesting.
yeah
I
other
didn't
big
know
part,
that was in the thing, but yeah.
the other big part of it, and that was actually the single biggest thing I think that I had like a couple of weeks of like very good progression in terms of like how I was doing already, and that was part of it, was like properly interweaving that. Like the chi efficiency is high. The other big one, and this is a real big one for me, is that you're only supposed to like prioritize those chi or energy spenders when you're almost capped at energy. And like I will also, like, there's like a couple conditions there, but like I have like, so like in my mind, like you do Tiger Palm, Blackout Kick, Tiger Palm, Blackout Kick, whenever like you're like at the bottom of the pool. And technically, the right thing to do there is, if you're not capped at energy, is you like Blackout Kick something else to proc combo strikes. Like for me,
Mhm.
that's usually like Chi Wave, and then Blackout Kick again if you have the Chi for it. But I will very often just like press Tiger Palm out of kind of like rote memory. And like these are like very small optimizations, but I think that this is kind of like the difference between like the goods and the greats. Although maybe it's just because I haven't been spamming fucking train kick, because that's what you're supposed to do.
No, I know. Actually, this is what I think is so compelling about WoW. And like when you told me, like you tweeted this the other day about how like you think 14 is better,
Oh, Final Fantasy
equal
14.
if not better, right,
Yeah,
than everything in WoW. But it is like I think these rotational things are the things that are like at the end of the day, this is like the very core of it. It is the neutron star at the center of the solar system of like the massive amount of gameplay that WoW supports is just like how interesting it is. Like, man, in raid, I pay attention, and the rate at which I'm making these decisions is like insane in a certain sort of sense. Because like, so another thing that I do that's common. Because Arms Warrior is all about managing your rage. You never want to cap on rage, obviously, but you also want to save enough rage in the bank to be using your Mortal Strikes every 6 seconds, right? So the typical rule of thumb is that you only use the filler rage spender slam whenever you're above 60, right? But that does change technically, like based on what talents you're going. So for instance, I'm also running Rend, which costs 30 rage and is a bleed, and I want to have also 30 rage in the bank for Rend. So at any individual moment, like between GCDs, I'm paying attention to where my Rend cooldown is at and my what the Rend up on a target looks like. I'm paying attention to where my Mortal Strike cooldown is at. I'm paying attention to my swing timer because I'm going to see, am I going to hit a swing and get more rage before my next GCD happens? And then I'm paying attention to where my overpower procs are. I'm obviously paying attention to all of my big cooldowns. And then I'm paying attention to um and then I'm paying attention to my filler. Like, is this the correct moment to use slam? Yes, no, right? And there are some times where I opt into decisions in that whole tree that are, it feels like these are taking place at like light speed, right? Because in between a GCD, 1.5 seconds, I'm going, okay, Mortal Strike is up in 3 seconds, and I don't need to refresh Rend, but I don't have an overpower proc to spend, so I think I'm going to risk it on Slam because I see the swing timer is going to hit before my next GCD, and I'm pretty sure I'll get enough rage off of that to add to my current level of 38 rage to then put me above the 60 that I would need. And right, like, and that's a to condense that much decision making not only into the 1.5 seconds, but into the 1.5 seconds where I am also like the seeds for Artificer are coming out or whatever, like all of whatever. That's not even talking about any of the raid mechanics. I think that that's like an immensely compelling experience.
yeah,
And like, if I were to ever explain to somebody what makes WoW raiding and like high, like and like mythics and stuff like super, super fun, it's like those sorts of interactions, right? Like where you are analyzing and making decisions about each individual button press at this like insane, like at this insane sort of rate. To that end, though, I do think that there are like really interesting choices that are kind of like offered by conduits and also by legendaries. But one of the things that I think is interesting is that like so conduits and legendaries do sort of the same thing, right? Both of them sort of like spice up your build in the way that you approach like the game to a certain extent, right? For instance, taking the Touch of Death legendary changes your like a focus of your power, however much that might be. It's probably only a couple of percent, but whatever, from things like Blackout Kick and Fists of Fury to Touch of Death. Whereas taking the Zuen legendary might do the opposite, right? Where it's like, okay, well now part of my focus is when am I dropping Zuen for this huge haste amp that I'm going to get during the course of this versus, whatever, any other individual legendary that's like rotational, if that makes sense. But one of the things that's interesting about legendaries is legendaries are flat where conduits have to scale, right? So the Mortal Combo conduit starts at 10%, but it scales up to 16% capped right now, and presumably up to 18%, 19%, however far it's going to go in the future. Um, which does sort of make me think about how I would, as a WoW designer, look at a conduit and look at a legendary and say, this is a legendary effect and this is a conduit effect, right? Because in a certain sense, that Zuen legendary that you're wearing could also have been a conduit, or like the Touch of Death legendary could have been a conduit. It could have been Touch of Death reduces the cooldown by 48 seconds, and then by 52 seconds, and then by 56 seconds, and then by 60 seconds, for instance, right?
Yeah.
Rather than just the flat 60 that's on the legendary. And I wonder if there is something like to the decision making behind that like design ethos that is like part of these like 9.1 discussions.
Yeah. Just as a quick correction, it's not by 60 seconds, it's to 60 seconds. It's from 3 minutes to 60 seconds on the legendary. Um, which is great for like I definitely have fun with it in Mythic Plus, but like I think you're right, like can you build that I think part of the problem too is that the kind of static abilities on the covenant or on the covenants are a little bit too important, like they're overridingly
Mm.
important. Because like I like burrs, like I have the bottom of my tree, there's an ability that basically throws out like a damage, right? And that doesn't give me the second attack conduit, but it does so much damage, right? Like
I have heard this, by the way, that
yeah.
Nia's Burrs is like really gross. Funnily enough, I actually also use a Soulbind ability over a, but so the interesting thing is that I don't think Nia's Burrs is an interesting ability
Oh,
because
it
it's so
isn't.
passive.
It's
It doesn't
entirely
it
passive.
Yeah, but so the ability that I'm using right now on Bonesmith Hayermere is it's a proc, and it says when you land 10 critical strikes, your critical strike chance is increased by 18% for 10 seconds, right? And that has a 60-second internal cooldown, right? So this can only proc once every 60 seconds. So at the end of those 60 seconds, you're going to create a new timer. One of the neat things about being a warrior is the way Whirlwind works is Whirlwind technically hits 3 times. So for any individual Whirlwind hit, right, any of those could be crits. So compared to something like, in a certain sense, like Monk, right? Um, well, I guess Spinning Crank Kick also works this way, so it's not different.
That's
Compared to
that's just
something
if you're
like what's I'm trying to think of like a good hard hitting class that doesn't do something kind of along these lines. Maybe a good example is like Destro Warlock, which is like pumping a lot of damage into big big hits with Chaos Bolt, right? There isn't a lot of like incidental or like bop 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 kind of damage. I proc Bonesmith Hayermere's ability super often because a lot of the time I'm running, this is part of my Mythic Plus build. There's going to be multiple targets, so in like one whirlwind in a 5-person group, I could maybe get proc it, and definitely in 2 whirlwinds, right? But if I am a Destro Warlock, where each of my crits are coming from individual spell casts, well, that's 50, like let's say 15 or 20 different spell casts. That's an extra 30 seconds that at me as a Destro Warlock is adding to that internal cooldown just because it takes me that long to proc, these each individual cast,
right.
right? Whereas as a monk or as a warrior spamming whirlwind, it takes me no time to proc those extra hits just because of how like the way whirlwind works, and that feels good. Like recognizing that like feels
Yeah.
good. I mean, I I did sim it, and the sim did say that that was like correct. But it was like one of those things. Like I saw that, and I was like, this has got to be the best. This has got to be really fucking good. Not only that, because like, so the other piece of this is that, and this is something that won't sim out, right? In the mechanics of a Mythic Plus, right? Like a lot of the time there's a little bit you have like these little gaps of downtime like between a pull or whatever. And so being able to start a pull like relatively fresh, which would like include this ability, right? So I could start with Warbreaker Ravager, which are both on 45-second cooldowns, and then proc into 18% extra critical strike at the top of a trash pack because like the internal cooldown has reset between pulls or whatever. That's really gross because now not only am I taking advantage of the 18% crit, I'm taking advantage of the 18% crit in my previously, determined burst window. So I do think that those sorts of interactions are like really interesting. And Neo's burst for the damage it does is intensely not interesting. It is
I mean,
incredibly boring because it just procs. It just procs.
right. I mean, yeah, the same way. I wonder, like that's all. Like your description is interesting in theory, but I don't know how interesting it is in practice because you don't have any control over it, right? Like like yes, it's cool that it will proc at the top of your burst window, right? But like it's not like you control that, right? Like it's like if it happens, it happens, right? Like it's just determined by the fact that you have rapid hitting abilities. And similarly, right? Like Nia's burst is also like percent on hit, right? So it's kind of like it's diffused over, like because they
Mhm.
don't have to build up to 10 or whatever, but like that's just kind of like a pre-calculation, right? Like I'm like Onia's burst is better than I guess the pod tender equivalent one is standing in like, your Phalanx stomp, like more bonus for standing in your Phalanx stomp if I remember correctly. And there's also a couple other ones like passing versatility back and forth, but uh it's like just like it's very much a numbers calculation. Recognizing it is its own fun, but like I don't think there's a lot of since you don't have a lot of control over it. Like there's more math to do, right? There's more pre-calculation to run, I guess, but I don't like it's not like in the moment you can do that. And like I mean, maybe you can see the like. Do you see the countdown? Do you see the internal cooldown?
Well, so I don't see the internal cooldown, but I do see it proc, which is
Okay.
to say that it'll show up as a buff and it'll show you how many crits you have. And this is another interesting thing because sometimes this will happen where I will be sitting at a certain number of crits and then I will like um the other day I was doing a Sanguine Depths 15 and we were on the pack before a boss fight and I was sitting there and I was spamming execute to kill the last mob and then I looked up and I realized that I was at 9 out of 10
So you
and
held
I
off.
just sat and I didn't do anything on the boss or on the mob because I wanted the mob to die so that I could start the boss, get a crit, and immediately like walk
Yeah.
into the window.
Okay.
So there's
So
like
yeah,
a little bit of
yeah
those,
there's
but it
some of
is
those.
more the fun. It is like more the fun of like watching a something you planned for payoff,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. No, absolutely.
It
Well
is
played.
it is more about like, I know intellectually I took this thing because sometimes it'll it'll proc in the way that I want it to proc, and that'll feel really gratifying. And then in the middle of this burst window, I will just happen to notice, oh hey, would you look at that?
Yeah. I think a lot of that is also just kind of like feedback, right? Like I find burrs, or at
Mm.
least I found burrs like hard to see initially, mostly because it's like the same color scheme as the Phalanx stomp, right? So and they're usually like landing in the Phalanx stomp.
Yeah.
So, um,
Yeah, that's also true. Also, crits pop off the screen. This is a problem that I actually have with other skills. I think I technically I've gone hard for crit. All expansion crit is like the stat that I look for, which is technically true. Um, like crit haste are the best stats for warrior or whatever. But I think crit feels good because you see the
oh yeah,
numbers pop off screen in a way that like haste doesn't do that. I mean, haste I do like haste because playing at very high amounts of haste is very fun. Like in at the end of Battle for Azeroth, I was sitting at 80% haste, right? And just like going that fast feels like really great, and if it feels like you're on cocaine or something like that, right?
yeah,
But
no.
the other like versatility will never feel that good to
Oh,
me, just
but
because like
but believe me, I know versatility is the best stat for monks this patch, and like it just kind of like, and like I had to trade a bunch of crit out for it, right? Because like I
uh,
I like personally prefer crit because I like that kind of I like those big hits. Though I will say,
mm,
switching to the Zuins off of the Touch of Death, because this is that dynamic, right? Like Touch of Death is one big hit. Zuins, you pop Zuin and you get like a bunch of haste. popping it and having that moment where you're suddenly going so much faster, right? Like feels real good, especially because I'm also like a troll, right? So I can like do that with like enrage or whatever it's called, the troll racial.
Yeah, berserking. Yeah.
Like that all feels great together, right? Like, but I think there's definitely something to like being able to feel the stuff happening, right? Because like I have I think it's like the Lady Dark Vein trinket, the one that like you activated and it like does some damage, or like you add damage DOTs to the person, but like I just kind of like hit it on cooldown and apply damage when it happens, right? Like like maybe there's a little bit of finagling there that for like, a little bit of mastery bits, right? Like not like mastery, but personal like execution mastery, um, but like you know it's a number that happened. Like I know I hit the button and like, but like I can't really see it happening, right? Like I don't care. It's
Oh,
kind of
that's
like,
interesting. So do you know how that trinket works? The mastery point on that trinket is doing it with everybody else because it scales off of other people who have that trinket.
I that I does it? I
Yeah,
might.
so the way the trinket works is it does 5 hits of damage, right? And it applies stacks that make the damage you do, the subsequent damage you do more damage, right? The thing that makes that trinket good is if, let's say, 5 people are using it, the first person stacks those up to 5 because it stacks up to 25. The second person stacks it up to 10. The third person stacks it up to 15 or whatever. That's my understanding of how that
Oh,
trinket works.
really? Okay, so
It is not particularly good for me, but just reading, I remember I read the text, I was like, what the fuck does this mean? And then I saw it in action and I was like, oh, that's if I have the trinket. Because Merrick has it, I think, actually. And I saw like the stacks tick up on the boss. If I have it, that's my cue to be like, okay, I'm also gonna hit the trinket so that we're,
okay.
ramping it to plus 10, plus 15, that kind of thing.
I didn't realize that it stacked with other people's versions of it. That makes a lot more sense. Huh. That's it. Regardless, right? Like I think the point still kind of holds though, right? Like because like
Absolutely.
right, like there's like that moment, but like it's not like I'm feeling those numbers, right? Like
Hmm.
it's not like they're popping off I think this is a kind of hard thing to do with in raids anyway, just because like your numbers are like combining. Like there was a moment during like one of the earlier expansion shows, like they could just like tick down the health of the boss at like a constant rate, and none of us would probably notice, right? Like in aggregate we'd notice because like everybody would be clearing the boss at the same time, but like you
Yeah.
know, you could just like tick down the health of the boss by the average item level of everybody in the raid.
There were allegations of that in Legion, actually,
Really?
because so it was a big controversy because nobody's kill times were getting faster on bosses, which is what you would expect, right? You'd
Yeah.
expect if I come in, I kill the boss. Next week, I have a whole raid's lockout of loot going into the next boss, and we would kill it that much faster. We're that much more powerful. It turned out to be just a balancing thing. Like with the way the bosses were working, right? Like there were only certain sorts of damage phases or whatever, and like the bosses needed to be nerfed in such a way that you actually started to see those kill times like ticking down. But yeah, that was like a not like a real thing. That was like a dumb thing that
Yeah.
people conspiracy theorized about. But absolutely, it absolutely matters. And I think it's partly because like WoW has to give you damage for poor play up to a certain percentage, right? You have
Yep.
to like 70% of your damage has to be brain dead,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah.
Where you're not making good or interesting decisions. You're just kind of hitting buttons at random, right? Just by the function of the like how the game works, which means that all of the gains that we're talking about are typically 1 or 2% gains, right? And those add up over the course of, right? Like if I have the right outlook of stats, that's maybe 1%. If I have the right soul bind, that's another 2%. If I have the right legendary, that's number 5%, right? And over the top, over the course, I will add up the intervening 30% that differentiates me from a 70% player. But like it isn't as though a poor player does 0 DPS. A poor player just does 1K versus my 4K, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That definitely makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. But,
Are there any like legendary effects that you would like to see? Like if you could pitch a legendary for Windwalker, what would you think a cool legendary for Windwalker would be?
so my mind immediately jumps to like Touch of Death just works on raid bosses at like 10,000% player health because that'd be very stupid but very fun. But like um uh like No, just because I can't think of like off the top of my head, I can't think of something. Do you have one in mind for
Not off the top of my head. I mean, maybe I do. I don't know. There were a couple. I was thinking about Torghast powers, right? Like if I could have a Torghast power that is currently in Torghast and bring it out as a legendary power, what would I do and how would that how would that look essentially? And so something I was thinking is one of my favorite Torghast powers is one that says that like when you Mortal Strike, you have a certain percent chance to cast Whirlwind. I think I would really like that legendary power as an AoE focused legendary power that spices up the rotation. Because one of the things that sucks about uh the current way that Arms is built is the AoE is super bursty. It's all about your burst cooldowns, and the rest of it is just spamming more Whirlwind mostly. You're not really using Mortal Strike. And I think I would like to use like the idea that I'm now using Mortal Strike because it has a 30% chance, a 50% chance, or whatever percent chance to proc a free Whirlwind just to spice up that rotation would be nice. I don't know. I definitely think the single target legendaries are all there. Three of the arms maybe it's all four. It's Exploiter is single target, Enduring Blow is single target, Battlelord is single target. What's the last one? Fail in the chat. Do you remember what the last one is? Unhinged is single target. All four of the arms legendaries are single target legendaries. Yeah, so I would like an AoE legendary. Like there's one right now that is specific to the whole class that says your whirlwind deals you get an extra proc of whirlwind at 80% damage. So instead of hitting 3 times, it hits 4, and that fourth one is a little bit reduced. And then there's Signet of Tormented Kings, which says whenever you cast a cooldown, you cast one of the other two specs major cooldown at reduced effectiveness, which is like the legendary that I use. And that's very good, obviously, but I don't know. I feel like I wish there was like another cool thing I could do in an AOE, like in the AOE rotation. Um, that I don't know.
Yeah, no, I would say like I'm not a huge fan of like real like and none of the monk legendaries like really feel like super fun to me. Right? Like I like the Touch of Death one, but like it's also like not super interesting, right? It's like I kill something instantly, which is fun, but like it's not like it's not like super interesting gameplay. And like I said, the Zoomins one is fun just because like it's fun to hit buttons real fast every once in a while. But like I don't know. The only thing I can say is that there's one that like I don't like. There's one that like zooms you with your Tiger Palm to your target, and I hate that. Like I hate it whenever it comes up against a power and Torghast that I have to take. Like I absolutely despise it. So,
Yeah, I'm trying to think about like other classes. A lot of classes will have like cooldown reduction ones. Like Assassination Rogue has one that says like for the energy you use, you reduce your cooldown. There's a Fury one that's sort of like that, and I wonder if that would be fun. But the thing is that's hard to do with that is for arms, one of our capstone talents is called Anger Management, which says every 20 rage you spend reduces the cooldown of Blade Storm and Warbreaker by Colossus Smash by a second or whatever. And those things like hit critical mass pretty quickly if you use them in conjunction, obviously. So it's like, okay, well now every 20 rage you're using reduces your cooldown by a second, and every, what you like overpower reduces the cooldown by a further second, and now all of a sudden you're dealing with a 20-second Colossus Smash cooldown. Maybe that would be cool. Maybe that would be fun. I also think that the most interesting legendary in Arms right now is Battlelord, which is a proc that says they're changing it to overpower tomorrow, but it says right now it's slam, right? Your slam has a 40% chance to reset the cooldown of Mortal Strike. That is the legendary that affects me the most. Like I recognize having that legendary up more so than I do any of the others, because like obviously my priority thing is to hit Mortal Strike on cooldown as often as I possibly can. And so it makes me pay attention in a way that I don't normally pay attention, because I know Mortal Strike comes up every 6 seconds, right? That's the cooldown, so I'm kind of like prepared for that. But now every time I cast Slam, I have to be prepared. Holy shit, Mortal Strike just reset. Let's go, kind of thing. And I think that those sorts of legendaries are probably the most engaging in an active sense, right? They make me care the most. I wouldn't want to carry this in the open world where I'm not thinking and I don't want to think about these kinds of things. But like in a high intensity like raid environment or whatever, hell yeah, I would like another legendary on those sorts of lines that like really makes me think or consider or whatever, right? I guess for monks that would be like blackout kick or tiger palm have a set of chance of resetting.
so
Fist of Fury maybe.
yeah, so that would be the thing. Like like Shahao's Might is getting apparently getting patched tomorrow, but it reduces the cooldown of all of your brews, and Windwalkers get like fortifying brew. right? So like,
Yeah.
which is not like it's not like it's not super valuable. Like my top use for fortifying brew is to give me more health so I can touch of death earlier. So it's
That's actually funny. Yeah, this actually also hurts because there's another legendary, probably the legendary that I want to go the most is Misshapen Mirror, which says spell reflect lasts longer and applies to the the nearest member in my party. Cause like if there is anything I like doing, it is spell reflect shenanigans, right? It is learning the cool shit in all of the dungeons and all of the raids that I can spell reflect. And so the idea that I could tell somebody like, okay, stick on me, we're gonna spell reflect. The one I just learned the other day. At the end of the other side, there's the thing where Muazala like shoots a beam across half the platform. I can spell reflect that, which is like it negates that entire mechanic basically, right? And so being able to tell somebody, just stick close to me, I'm going to hit spell reflect. We're both just going to sit and DPS the boss, not worry about this mechanic, right? Or there are other mechanics. One of the cool interactions with spell reflect, I actually did it in the raid the other day. I can spell reflect the ads because the ads are a spell that the boss casts on us, and I had spell reflect up, and she targeted me for the ad, and that put the ad right on. It actually put the ad dot on her instead of putting the ad dot on me, which is like that's a really sweet interaction, but like it targets randomly, so like I can't guarantee it, and so like I wish I had the ability to use Misshapen Mirror to like do those kinds of shenanigans. They're used to Misshapen Mirror actually used to be the best. It was the best legendary they had in all of Shadowlands because it applied to the whole party. But then they very quickly realized that was really gross and broken because like hitting spell reflect and giving everybody not just like the ability to ignore a mechanic, right? But also the ability to but also the ability because it's just a flat 20% damage reduction for magic damage incoming. Is just like that was like broken.
yeah. No, I've been trying to get my mind around diffuse magic because it's like it's a similar effect. It transfers things that are already on you instead of spell reflect. It like reverses something incoming, right?
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
spell reflect, I have to beat it, right? If it is channeling on me, most of the time spell reflect won't. Unless it has like a, sometimes it'll have like an end of thing effect. So for instance, in Theater of Pain, there's the one where she sucks your soul out. The end of that is a big damage. She'll do like a ton of damage to you, but I can spell reflect that damage. Whereas most of the time you need to spell reflect before they cast the spell, and sometimes that's just a crapshoot, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what are you
The
gonna do?
diffuse magic, I think it has to be on you, and then it will transfer it back, which is neat.
That is neat, actually. I didn't know that was a thing. That is
Yeah.
super neat. I think the number one thing that they have done to make me like really invested in the game is adding spell reflect to like regular like all warriors, because it used to be a prod only thing.
Ah.
And I cared a lot about it. I was really good at using spell reflect in BFA, but now I'm using it as a DPS. It just feels like that much cooler because when you're a tank, it's a part of your DP, like your defensive rotation, but when you're a DPS, like it's like utility basically.
Yeah, yeah, and so like the difference, like in raid, I can't use diffuse magic like you do, like you use spell reflect because like you can do things like spell reflect and like intentionally trigger a mechanic. Like I can't do that. So like it's
Mm.
got less utility in that sense, but it's it's still neat, and it's something I'm learning because I had the passive one for a long time because it was less buttons to hit and I was felt overwhelmed when I started, and so been slowly building up my master. But we
That
are
is something that I have found pretty funny is that over time I'm putting more buttons on myself. I specifically did this for Gondar in Demonology. I'm going a different build in Demonology than the Demonic Portal build now, and that requires just using a lot more buttons. But like as I have gotten better at that class, I've gotten better at using the additional active abilities.
way over our
Yeah, we are
time.
way over time. So
Um,
tell me all about your week, I guess.
Yep. So the big things I did this week are I watched all of WandaVision, which we will be talking about next week. So nothing.
Be prepared.
Yeah, be prepared. Nothing. I'm not going to say too much. I'm going to say that I think it was good, but not great. And we'll talk about it more next week. Uh, and what else did I do? Oh, the other big thing I did was I played some Neo 2, which is a lot of fun. Um, Feels easier than the first one. Like Neo
Ooh.
is, if I don't know how many people are familiar, but it's basically like Dark Souls that had a baby with Diablo and like was big weeb shit. The first one was especially weeb because you played a white guy that went to Japan, um, which is it's a real historical figure, which is like one of the more interesting parts of the game to me. Obviously, he didn't fight demons, um,
Hmm.
or at least that's what the government wants you to believe. But the second one, it feels easier. There's a ton more mechanics, including like some burst kind of mechanics that I felt like made some of these earlier fights um, much easier. Friend of the cast Monarch has said that it gets harder, especially as you get into the new game pluses, which is not a thing that like Dark Souls has that. But like it's not. I think it's much of a focus of the game as apparently it is in Neo 2, which is also obviously a very Diablo-esque thing. So I think that that's like from there. I'm having fun with it. I'll probably put some more time into it. But otherwise, I don't think I have a lot of notables.
So an interesting thing is you did it. Did we talk about your mythic last week? Did we talk about it this week?
No,
Because you did a mythic for the first time, right?
we did. I did a high level mythic for the first time. We did it after
Yeah.
this podcast, so that
Yeah.
was
Yeah. Okay. So what was that like? What was your experience
well.
like?
I felt bad. I felt real bad because like I screwed up, right? Like I screwed up some mechanics. I know part of it was like this was like we started at like 11 something, which is
Yeah.
close to my witching hour of falling over. So um we finished after when I normally go to bed, which is not a problem in itself, just kind of like a problem in that like I got tired and like I
What
didn't.
level was it? It was a 12,
It
right?
was a 12, yeah.
Okay.
Um,
That is way above, like
like
I guess I don't think you should feel bad about that, obviously. And I don't think anybody did because at the end of the week people just burn keys, like nobody cares sort of thing. It's just like you just get through it to get something good in the chest or whatever. But the 12 is woof.
yeah, no,
I actually think a 12 is out of range of a lot of people in our raid because they don't run enough mythics to do them well.
and like the biggest mythic I'd done before that I think was like a 2. So
Hmm.
and like part of it is just like not knowing the mechanics, right? Like I didn't know what needed to happen, and like I was off on my timing on some things, and like just like little optimizations, right? Like I accidentally rolled into a pile of like bleh on a boss, and it killed me. Things were like I things were like in a raid, since everything's a little bit more diffused out. I can,
Hmm.
be a little bit more relaxed. Also, like a single death in a raid isn't as big a deal. So like, if I screw up, it's not necessarily like the end of the encounter, which it kind of is in Mythic Plus. Um, Definitely interesting, and definitely a thing that I thought was fun, but not a thing that I know if I care enough to devote the time to get good at it. Essentially, right? Like,
Yeah,
um,
definitely.
and this is interesting, right? Because like I would definitely jump in and play with people on like something a little bit more moderately level. Like if people are burning keys and they don't care, right? Like whatever, I'll jump in. Like I feel like I've got enough that like we we can get through it, and like like you said at the end of it, it's like I was expecting that to take over an hour, and it took us like maybe like half an hour for I think it was Miss Tuna Scythe, and so like
Hmm.
I think I've got enough base confidence to like hit kind of that level. But something that's interesting is right is like if let's say you're like, okay, Mango, let's get you trained up on this. It is against your interest to go run like 5s and 6s with me to teach it to me, because like then your chest suffers, right? Like that's which I think is a bad set of incentives, but like I don't quite understand like why
Technically speaking, I run so many mythics at this point that I don't think my chest would suffer. I spent yesterday running a bunch of 6s and 7s to help gear somebody, and part of that is just I have 10 14s already, so my chest is maxed out at this point.
okay, so
But that's
it's
just because I am intensely addicted to these mythics.
okay. So you had mentioned previously that there was like reason why you like wouldn't want to run people through it. Like, does it negative like it's the worst of your top 10 keys, right, or something like
Mhm.
that? Okay, so
Yeah,
like
so
if you were in between in an in between stage, where if you were at like 11 keys, then you would yeah, or if like
a
you
couple of a couple of weeks ago, I was running 10 a week. I wanted all three options in the chest, and so I was and so that then I was pretty hyper about like not doing bad. Like I wouldn't take anything under my level basically. Um but over time I've just been doing more and more of these. Part of this is that I also found a like a group which is essentially like it was a pug group, not quite. It's like 4 friends who I met at a summoning stone. Like the guy just whispered me, and he was like, "Oh man, Necrolord's Warrior, that's cool." And I was like, "Yeah, it's sweet." And then we did one together, and we just like BNet friended after that. And now over time, we are basically like a dedicated Mythic Plus team, right? Like I'm gonna do all 10 probably with this group of guys over the course of a week. But I'm also obviously going to run with people from the raid, because there are a couple of other people in the raid who run as hard as I do. Savadar, Marok also, Mingo Nashoba is like running. Like these are the people who I think are running at keys at my level essentially. Like these
Right.
are 14s and 15s kind of like pushers. And then there's kind of like good players who do enough but not like a lot, right? So like Lindley, for instance, Josh would be in this level, because like he'll do his 4 chest pretty reliably at like the 12, 13 level, but not much more than that. And then there are players who don't do any mythics really, right? Like they come in, maybe they'll do 1 a week, maybe they'll do, and the big thing there is that like in a mythic 0 or in a regular level mythic, a lot of things are hits, but they're not one-shot mechanics, right? So for instance, yesterday when I was running in this +6, I sat in a Sinquake, which is this thing. It's incredibly telegraphed. The big golem slams the ground, a little brown swirly is under you, and then rocks shoot up. In a 15, that's a one shot. In a 12, that's probably a one shot, right? In a 6, you get bumped up. You take a damage, right? You take 15, 20k, but if you're at max HP, you just get healed for that, right? And I think that's the core difference. Also, is knowing what to like. One of the big things is like what to interrupt, what to stun, what to stop. We had a really tough time in dungeons like Spires of Ascension and Theater of Pain before we got our interrupts really down. Because like now in Theater of Pain, we could go mob by mob, and I could tell you like this, you save your interrupt for that, you save your interrupt for this other thing. It's really for Spires that it matters, because in Spires every single pull has something you have to save an interrupt for, kind of thing. But like it's those sorts of things which are like high end mastery optimization, kinds of high end mastery and optimization kinds of play that like you have to do lots and lots of mythics to get.
Yeah, no, I get that. I get that. And that would be that's like a fun thing to do, but like I do want to play other games, and I don't. I
Yeah.
find myself. I'm curious how you feel about this. I find myself like, even though like I don't really have a good reason for it, I feel like I have less time to actually play games. Like even during the pandemic, right? Like maybe I'm like, um, listening to a podcast or like cooking something,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's just kind of like, or like watching YouTube videos or something, right? It's just like it cuts down on my gaming time.
See, this was one of my key innovations. Is pugging a mythic became a very easy thing for me to do while just like watching a YouTube video on my other screen.
Okay.
Because like, and funnily enough, I do better in pugs because I'm not like doing the raid lead thing of like calling out mechanics and stuff like that. Because in a pug, you just got to worry about yourself. We've talked about this. And that's become a really easy thing for me to just like. I log in, I apply to a bunch of groups. Most of them say no, somebody will say yes, and we just sit and we run through the dungeon. And like, I guess I just have a deep enough understanding of these dungeons that it's not like a huge draw. But a lot of the time, I'm watching Lindsay Ellis ContraPoints video, whatever. Yesterday it was movies. I watched a bunch of movies yesterday. I watched My Dinner with Andre, which sucked. That movie's bad. I
Oh man,
think.
I want to watch that movie, but only because of the community reference.
That was my thing. Is we've talked before about doing a community episode, and I was like, am I really gonna do a community watch through and not have seen My Dinner with
With
Andre?
Andre.
Which I lied to people a lot about having seen that movie.
Oof, a poser,
In
a
college,
poser.
yeah, in college, I was a huge poser about My Dinner with Andre. I was like, oh yeah, of course I've seen that movie. No, that movie, by the way, one of the most pretentious movies I think I've ever seen in my life, and I wanted to like pull my head. I just
Is it a famous
you'll
director?
probably hate this. Is it a famous director? No, not really. Wallace Shawn is famous. Obviously, he's like the inconceivable guy. He's in it. Maybe it is a famous director, but it wasn't anybody I noticed off the top of my head. I think the big thing with My Dinner with Andre is just like it is literally just it is sitting down and talking to somebody, right, for 90 minutes. 2 hours, actually. It's a little bit longer than that. Let's see.
Louis
Louis
Maillet.
Malle, who is a French filmmaker who did nothing I recognize at a glance except for My Dinner with Andre. So,
Yeah. Uh,
oh wait, oh my God, he did the Jacques Cousteau documentary. Okay,
okay.
that's probably what he's famous for. But anyway, um, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I also watched Battleship, which was a very dumb decision because that movie is really dumb, but it was actually dumb in a pretty interesting way because they actually implement as plot mechanics the mechanics of the game Battleship, where you can't see anything, but you're like hitting points on a grid. And I sat there and I was just like, I cannot believe we spent 90 minutes of like filmmaking getting to the point where they are playing the they're playing the game Battleship in like the plot of this movie.
Is it like a convoluted like excuse for it, or is it just kind of like pretending like that's the way that real battleships work?
No. It's a convoluted excuse for it. So what happens in Battleship is aliens show up. They put a big dome over Hawaii, basically, right? And there's only one missile cruiser, and later, and this is a huge spoiler. I'm sorry to spoil this movie for you. They take the USS Missouri, which is like the biggest battleship the United States has ever made. It's a museum now in Pearl Harbor. Um, they take it out of being a museum and fire it up with a bunch of World War II veterans, and I am not fucking joking. They actually do it. Um, and and what happens is the enemy spacecraft are also behaving like ships. They're all along the water or whatever. But if they get too close, the ships will just blow them up because they have super crazy advanced alien weaponry. So the only thing that they can do is stay out of the ship's sight range, right? They can't. Oh, and they're also radar invisible, obviously. And so they tap into this network of tsunami buoys, which are like buoys that like measure displacement in the water to warn of a tsunami. And they take those buoys, they make a grid out of those buoys, and then they use the displacement of the water from the alien spaceships as they move through the waters, hitting those buoys to show there is a thing here. And then they shoot into the grid. So they go like, oh, you got to hit, they use like, it's like Roger 6, I think is the grid, and they shoot at Roger 6, and then there's a guy who goes hit or miss based on whatever information. That doesn't actually make sense, actually. That's probably a plot hole now that I think about it. Because if they're out of sight range, how is he going to confirm it's a hit or a miss? But yep, that's how that works. It was fucking stupid as shit. It was so dumb.
Speaking of, go on, go on. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's okay. I was gonna move on to the next thing.
I was speaking of stupid movies. If you remember, a couple weeks ago, I said I watched Goodfellas for the first time, right?
Yeah.
And like, I I recognized Ray Liotta, but I didn't know what from, and I figured out later it was from Hubie Halloween, which is like the worst movie I saw this year. Yeah.
Well, that's Ray Liotta.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
the other thing that I watched is I watched all the Austin Powers movies, which at this point read like I mean, this is not my take. This is a Patrick Willems take, where he basically pointed out that like if you watch Austin Powers now, it reads like satire of the current generation of filmmaking, right? Um, Specifically because in the third movie, it's revealed that Dr. Evil and Austin Powers are secretly brothers. They've been brothers this whole time, right? And that is a plot twist that was unironically used in a real James Bond movie, Spectre, which came out in whatever year that fucking came out in, right? That I think we may have done a podcast on.
I don't
So
think so.
it is a thing that parodied a hacky, dumb trope 20 years before the thing happened.
Right,
Which like blew my mind.
obviously it's because it's supposed to be like also a parody moment of Star Wars, right? Like
No, that's what I know. So it is well, it's kind of a parody moment of Star Wars. But like the fact that Austin Powers, who is a gigantic spoof of James Bond,
right.
right? and then a James Bond movie
movie.
uses that. Like, it's, I don't know. I was just, that
So
was completely ridiculous.
I am curious. Watching those movies now, like, do you think they could have been made now? Because it's been a long time since I've seen them, and like they were like kind of like '90s, early aughts, raunchy in a way that like is kind of frowned upon in the current age.
There are specific things in those movies that I think would play very well now. For instance, one of my favorite, I think actually the best bit in any of these movies is at the beginning of the beginning of the second film picks up right after the end of the first film, where Vanessa, the girl, and Austin get together, they get married, and they're like having sex at the end of the first movie. Second movie begins with that, and then it's revealed that Vanessa has secretly been a fembot this whole time, and pops machine guns out of her boobs and shoots Austin a bunch. And then Austin tells Basil Exposition, his boss, "Did you know Vanessa was a fembat?" And he said, "Yes, we've known this whole time, sadly. Anyway, here's your next assignment." And just like move right on. And I realized that like that moment of continuity between the first movie and the second movie is sort of, I think, maybe one of the first moments of like real and direct continuity between films in this sort of like comedy film, right? Like that we really like, I think it's a big stepping stone towards like the Marvel movies, right? Where late stage Marvel movies are entirely incomprehensible without, the previous context of other ones, right? Right. Imagine Avengers Endgame. Um, without watching all of the other, without watching all of the other Marvel movies, for instance. Um, that
So,
I feel like that's actually pretty significant. Is that like that stepping stone from 1997 to 1999, right? These movies were produced 2 years apart. This is a movie where you are expected to remember the specific plot details of the movie that came right before it. I was also surprised to see so many. There were lots and lots of callback jokes, like references to the previous movies, including things like just like throwaway bits and like lines that I was like, wow, that's like a really deep cut. The third movie, Goldmember, came out in 2002, which was then 7 years from the original Austin Powers, but it's referencing things in the original Austin Powers, right? That like got established in the original Austin Powers, which I was just like, wow, it might be the first instance in modern filmmaking that I can think of that happening.
I felt similar like comedy. I think you're right. I felt very similarly about Ocean's 13. That there were some cuts
Mm,
that I thought weren't like super clear unless you were like like I watched them all in the three of them in like a month. Um, and so and so like I saw those moments, but it's like, yeah, no, you were expected to know what was happening. It wasn't super lampshaded either, right? The big one in Ocean's 13 is the villain from the second one shows up in the background. The camera does this thing where it like zooms in on him, but like they don't explain why he's there. Right? It's like if you didn't remember him from 12, right? Like you wouldn't know. You'd be like, what is this? Like the camera's obviously panning to this guy for a reason. And then he does like he has like a bit piece at the end, but like
mm-hmm.
very similar.
Nope, yeah, that is absolutely true. And like my previous Rosetta Stone for this is the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Like I think the most important movies of 21st century cinema are probably the three Lord of the Rings films, because I think that was the thing that proved to kind of the Hollywood business that this kind of thing can work, that audiences are smart enough to comprehend it, right? Like that we can go from Fellowship to Two Towers without really any breathing room. Like people just, if you pick up Two Towers in the middle of it, right? Like there's not a lot of context there, but like the expectation was everyone had seen Fellowship and they had, and then the expectation was everyone had seen Two Towers and they had for Return of the King, right? Um, but it was really interesting watching Austin Powers and being like, oh man, this is like 3 years before Lord of the Rings, 4 years before actually Lord of the Rings, that they were like doing this kind of thing and just expecting you to understand it. I think the other example obviously is Star Wars, by the way, which is probably like the very very beginning of this. Star Wars, Indiana Jones a little bit, but not that much. There's a
Yeah,
couple
in
of other like
the
small.
like the second Indiana Jones is a prequel, right? So like you theoretically didn't even never had to see the first one, right? Like other
Yeah,
than
and there's I really, I'm just assuming they're there, I guess. I haven't seen the Indiana Jones movies in a long time. I just like assume those kinds of continuity
There's not a
references
lot from what I remember, but
stretch between them. Yeah, like, but obviously, like the gap from A New Hope to Empire, and then Empire to Return of the
yeah,
Jedi, like those are like real examples of this, and they really like predate 20 years ahead of the curve kind of thing. But for the most part, I feel like movies made in those eras are kind of like one and dones, right?
yeah, and even if they're
Whereas
serials,
now,
right? Like they're just kind of like,
yeah,
right, like, um, yeah, I think you're right. I wonder, just kind of on your point of, the Star Wars, Lord of the Rings is like, the first, like, the audience can do this. I also wonder if it's also like kind of like the moment that like being a nerd went mainstream, if that makes sense,
oh,
right?
I also think that's true. I mean, I think it is a confluence of a couple different things. It is, Batman and Robin getting absolutely trashed by fans of Batman. It's the X-Men movie coming out and making, uh, like making a gazillion dollars at the box office. Obviously, Spider-Man is in the same thing. Set a million records. Spider-Man 2 and 3 are kind of all in those things. But really, like, I think that the core of it is the Lord of the Rings, because first of all, the Lord of the Rings is it had that 3-year thing where they shot the whole movie at once. So whereas if I'm X-Men, you don't end on, I mean, you end on kind of a cliffhanger or whatever, but there's no expectation to shoot a sequel until like the sequel
Right.
happens, if that makes sense. Whereas Lord of the Rings, they shot all three of them back to back, right? All three of those movies were shot in a 2-year period so that they would be like built for the franchise, which I think is a better modern representation of how we approach like filmmaking, right?
Yeah,
There
because
was always going to be a Spider-Man 2, right? Um, even and even if they weren't like filmed at the same time, right? Like we always knew that that next one was
yeah, and
coming, and it
like
was coming in
Kevin
a few
Feige
circumstances.
like has planned out the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is,
Exactly.
and this is funny because we just were talking about Star Wars, and the Star Wars sequels were definitely not planned that way.
They were definitely not played that way at all, which is funny because like if you think about it, the original Star Wars codified this, and then the Star Wars sequels failed at it.
Failed at it so
Which
miserably, right?
But
Like,
even the prequels are a great example of this. Prequels came out right in this time, right? Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, and I would say that they're more episodic, which is why I wouldn't
yeah,
say like the Phantom Menace is the first example of this. Also, there's plenty of time. Phantom Menace comes out, was that 99, and then 4 years later, whereas the Lord of the Rings are pop 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 1, 2, 3. Um, but yeah, and then also the Lord of the Rings won the Oscar, which is that is the craziest
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
That Return of the King won all those fucking Oscars, right? Which is I think where, I mean, people complain about movies today and movies in the 2000s and movies whatever. If there are real doldrums for movies, it is the fucking 90s, where it's shit like Independence Day. Like, I mean, Independence Day,
It's fun.
it's fun. It is fine in a like dumb as rocks way. It is just incredibly straightforward. There is nothing more serious going on underneath. It is just compelling action adventure. Fair enough. Right? But the difference between the filmmaking in Independence Day and the filmmaking in, I don't know, what's a modern version of Independence Day?
Not the new
I, I,
Independence Day.
yeah, I'm trying to think. Most of these are bad, right? Like that that are in these sort of say. It's like Independence Day is so contained because it has to do it all in one movie, whereas the Marvel movies can stretch that out a little bit
Mm.
more, right? Like, or even just even Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings movies tell a character arc for Aragorn that takes place over the course of three-hour movies, which is just like you have so much more time to get into the nuance of it, right? Um, Aragorn, like going from Aragorn, who's very reluctant to accept his heritage, to Aragorn, who is earnestly heroic and saving the kingdom of Rohan because he feels so deeply for these people, to finally the Aragorn that assumes the mantle of the king of Gondor as he is, restored the Numenorian bloodline or whatever else. You know what I mean? Like that is an arc that takes place over the course of 3 movies, which is huge. And I think that is a much more complex story than Will fucking Smith and
Welcome to
listen,
Earth.
yeah, even good movies from the 90s like Jurassic Park also had very like one and done stories.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah. No. No. It's interesting because like I'm interested to see how you feel about WandaVision, right? Because like that's like this taken to its like ultimate, you know, you take a Marvel movie and you take all of its context and then you take one Marvel movie and you stretch it over 9 episodes, which is like I think it's like somewhere between like 5 and 7 hours, somewhere in there, because like the episodes are like half an hour to an hour a piece, I think.
Well, that's a lot of content. I tell you what,
Yeah,
but we'll
and
talk about that
yeah,
next
next
time.
week, and that's a good place to end it, I think. So, if you'd like to tell us what you think about any of the things we talked about this podcast, World of Warcraft patches, this history of cinema, you can email us at subversiveplaygames@gmail.com or podcast@subversiveplaygames.com. You can follow us on twitch.tv/subversiveplaygames where these episodes air live. Um, you can rate and review us on everywhere that you can find podcasts. That's everything I had. Buddy, you have anything else you want to promote?
I have nothing else that I am looking to promote.
In that case, until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners.